My name is Calla Bennett. A month after my divorce, my sister stood at our family reunion, smiled at everyone, and said, "Poor Calla. She's basically living in her car now." The room went quiet. People looked at me with pity. I didn't correct her, because my SUV really was parked outside town, just not where she thought. It was sitting beside 5 acres of land, where my dream home was already being built. She thought she was telling everyone I'd lost everything. She had no idea. I was hiding the one thing that was about to change her story forever. By the time my divorce was finalized, everyone in my family believed they already knew the story. According to my sister, Sienna, I'd been abandoned. According to my mother, I had given up too easily. According to my relatives, I was another woman who couldn't keep her marriage together. The funny part? Not one of them ever asked why I left. They simply accepted the version that sounded more entertaining. I stopped correcting them. Sometimes silence tells you more about people than arguments ever could. When I left Gavin, I didn't leave because we ran out of love. I left because I was tired of asking permission to live my own life. Every purchase became an argument. Every decision became a debate. Every success somehow threatened him. The night I packed my SUV, Gavin stood in the doorway and laughed. "You'll be back. You've got nowhere else to go." I looked him in the eyes and quietly replied, "You keep believing that." Then I drove away. I already had a plan. He just didn't know it. About 2 weeks later, my aunt called. Her voice sounded unusually gentle. "Honey, I heard you're sleeping in your car." For a second, I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, "Who told you that?" Silence. Then she awkwardly admitted, "Sienna mentioned it." Apparently, my older sister had been telling everyone I was basically homeless. I thanked my aunt for checking on me. Then I ended the call. Interesting. The rumor had spread faster than anyone had ever spread the truth. Within days, the messages started arriving. One cousin offered me old blankets. Another relative sent information about emergency housing. Someone from church mailed me a grocery gift card. They all meant well. But every message reminded me of one thing. Nobody had actually called to ask how I was doing. They only called after hearing Sienna's version. I accepted the kindness, not the assumptions. Technically, my sister wasn't completely lying. I really was sleeping in my SUV some nights. But not because I had nowhere to live. Because every morning I woke up looking at 5 beautiful wooded acres I'd quietly purchased months earlier. No neighbors, no traffic, just tall pine trees and complete silence. Every sunrise reminded me why I'd made this choice. I wasn't homeless, I was investing in my future. I'd bought the property using savings I'd started years before I ever married Gavin. Tiny deposits, extra freelance income, holiday bonuses. Money nobody knew existed. The land didn't have a house, no electricity, no running water, just a gravel entrance and a small clearing. To everyone else, it probably looked empty. To me, it looked like freedom. A few weeks later, Mom insisted I attend our annual family reunion. I don't want people thinking something's wrong. Interesting choice of words. Not, "I miss you." Not, "How are you healing?" Just, "People will talk." I almost declined. Instead, I decided to go. Something told me I'd learn more by listening than speaking. The reunion had barely started when Sienna wrapped an arm around one of Mom's friends. Then she pointed directly at me. "There she is. My little sister. She's basically living in her car after the divorce." Several people slowly turned toward me. Some smiled politely. Others looked genuinely heartbroken. I simply smiled back. Because the truth didn't need defending. It only needed time. As lunch continued, I quietly filled my plate. I wasn't interested in correcting anyone. Then I noticed a man in work boots staring at me from across the pavilion. He frowned for a moment, then slowly walked toward our table. He looked at me, then smiled like something had just clicked. Hold on. Weren't you building that cabin on Ridge Road? For a moment, I didn't answer. Every conversation around us stopped. Sienna slowly turned toward me. Her smile disappeared. Everyone looked back and forth between us. The man smiled. I thought I recognized you. Before he could say another word, I quietly interrupted. It's okay. We'll talk another time. He nodded respectfully and walked away. But the damage was already done. For the first time all afternoon, my sister wasn't controlling the conversation anymore. She looked at me with narrowed eyes, almost like she'd realized I was hiding something. And she was absolutely right. The reunion ended, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man who recognized me. As I walked toward the parking lot, he caught up with me. He held out his hand. I'm Nash Mercer. I'm the general contractor building the cabin on Ridge Road. I smiled. So you remembered me? He laughed. It's hard to forget someone who spends every evening checking blueprints after working a full-time job. Then he lowered his voice. I didn't mean to surprise you back there. I glanced toward the reunion. It's okay. They were going to find out eventually. I just wasn't ready for today. The next morning looked nothing like my family imagined. I woke up inside my SUV parked beside my property. I folded my sleeping platform into storage, changed clothes, then drove to my gym. Hot shower, coffee. After that, I spent 8 hours working remotely as a project coordinator. Nobody knew, because nobody had ever asked what I actually did all day. They preferred the version where I was helpless. That afternoon, I met Jasmine Holt at the county office. She smiled as she handed me another document. Congratulations. Your building permit has officially been approved. I couldn't stop smiling. Months of paperwork. Finally finished. My cabin wasn't just an idea anymore, it was becoming real. As I walked back to my SUV, I realized something. I'd accomplished more alone in 3 months than I ever had while asking everyone else for approval. That evening, my phone buzzed. A cousin had accidentally sent me a screenshot meant for someone else. Sienna had written, Kala refuses to accept help because she's embarrassed. Another message followed. Honestly, I don't think she's coping with the divorce very well. Then someone replied, Poor thing. I stared at the screen. Interesting. Nobody had asked me a single question. Yet somehow, they all believed they knew my life. A few days later, I stopped at a local bakery. While waiting in line, 2 women from my parents' church recognized me. One gently squeezed my arm. We've been praying for you. The other whispered, If you ever need somewhere to sleep. I smiled kindly. Thank you. They were good people. They genuinely cared. The sad part was, their kindness had been built on someone else's lie. That weekend, my ex-husband Gavin called. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. He sounded strangely confident. I heard you're having a hard time. I stayed quiet. Then he continued. You don't have to prove anything anymore. I've got a spare bedroom. You can stay there until you get back on your feet. Not reconciliation, not love, a guest room, like I was someone who needed rescuing. I quietly pressed the record button on my phone. After a few minutes, Gavin finally admitted why he'd called. If we're being honest, it would make the property paperwork easier. I frowned. What paperwork? He laughed. If you're staying with me again, you'll probably stop chasing that little land idea. There it was. He thought I couldn't afford to keep my property. He had no idea. I'd already removed myself from every debt connected to our marriage months earlier. He still believed I needed him. He was completely wrong. Monday morning, Nash called. You might want to drive out here. When I reached my property, I froze. The foundation had been poured. For months, my dream had existed only on paper. Now, It was real concrete beneath my feet. I stood there smiling like a little kid. Nobody from my family knew where I was. Nobody knew why I looked so happy. And honestly, I liked it that way. While I was measuring the porch area, my neighbor from the next property walked over. His name was Cole Ramirez. He introduced himself with a friendly smile. "I've been watching the progress." Then he pointed toward my SUV. "I figured you were staying here while everything's being built." I nodded. "Just temporarily." He smiled. "That's actually pretty smart." Interesting. A complete stranger understood my plan better than my own family ever had. That night, I parked beside my land again. The stars were brighter than anything I'd ever seen in town. I looked at the fresh concrete foundation, then at my little SUV. People thought this vehicle represented failure. To me, it represented freedom. I could have corrected every rumor. I could have told everyone about the land, about the permits, about the cabin. But I didn't. Because sometimes, the most satisfying revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's letting them believe the lie, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Over the next 6 weeks, my little cabin started taking shape. First came the framing, then the roof, then the windows I'd spent months saving for. Every evening after work, I drove straight to Ridge Road. I carried lumber, painted trim, cleaned the site. Sometimes I was exhausted, but every nail I hammered into that cabin reminded me I wasn't rebuilding after a divorce. I was building a life no one else could control. While my cabin kept growing, so did Sienna's stories. At Sunday dinner, she sighed dramatically. "I'm really worried about Calla." Mom frowned. "Has she found a place yet?" Sienna shook her head. "I don't think so. I heard she's still sleeping in that SUV." I sat quietly across the table. Nobody asked if it was true. Dad simply sighed. "I never thought she'd end up like this." For a second, I almost laughed. If only they knew where I'd slept the night before. A few days later, the electric company arrived. Watching the lights come on inside my cabin nearly brought me to tears. For months, I'd been using lanterns and battery packs. Now, I flipped one switch. Warm light filled the room. Nash smiled. "Congratulations. It finally feels like a home." I looked around the tiny living room. It already did. The electricity was just catching up. The following weekend, my parents asked me to come over. When I walked inside, everyone was waiting. Mom, Dad, Sienna, Landon, even my aunt. Mom slid a brochure across the table. It was for temporary housing assistance. Dad quietly said, "You don't have to live like this." Sienna reached for my hand. "We're all worried." I looked around the room. Not one person asked where I'd actually been living. They had already decided the answer. Then Sienna pulled another envelope from her purse. I made a list. Inside were phone numbers, women's shelters, emergency housing, community programs. She smiled proudly. "I just want to help." I folded the papers neatly, then thanked her. Not because I needed them, because arguing would only ruin the surprise waiting ahead. That evening, Gavin called again. "I've been thinking. I'll make this easy. If you give up any remaining property claims, I'll help you get back on your feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He still thought I was desperate. I calmly replied, "I'm doing just fine." He laughed. "Calla, you can't honestly enjoy living in your car." I smiled to myself. "I enjoy waking up exactly where I chose to be." Before he could respond, I hung up. 3 weeks later, Jasmine Holt met me outside the cabin. She carefully walked through every room, checked every outlet, every smoke detector, every permit. Finally, she signed the inspection form. Then she smiled. "Congratulations. This home officially passed." I held the paperwork in my hands for several seconds. Nobody from my family knew. And tomorrow, they were all gathering for another reunion. That evening, Sienna texted the family group chat. Can't wait to see everyone tomorrow. Then another message. Hopefully Kala comes too. Followed by a laughing emoji. She probably needs a free meal. Several relatives reacted with laughing faces. I simply put my phone down. Tomorrow, those same people would learn something they never expected. The next afternoon, I drove to the reunion. Not in a luxury car. Not wearing expensive clothes. Just jeans, boots, and a quiet smile. As I walked toward the picnic shelter, I noticed Nash and his wife, Aubrey, setting up food nearby. Our eyes met. He gave me a polite nod. Neither of us said a word. Not yet. Halfway through lunch, Sienna stood beside the dessert table. She laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Some people just never recover after divorce. Then she looked directly at me. I mean, she's still basically living in her car. Several relatives looked down awkwardly. Before I could answer, Aubrey frowned. She looked from Sienna to me, then asked one simple question. Wait, are you talking about Calla Bennett? The woman who owns that beautiful new cabin on Ridge Road? The entire reunion fell silent. And for the first time all year, Sienna had absolutely nothing to say. The silence lasted several seconds. Everyone looked at Aubrey, then at me. Finally, Sienna forced a nervous laugh. I think you've got the wrong person. Aubrey smiled politely. No. I've watched that cabin being built for months. Then she glanced toward Nash. My husband was the contractor. He came home talking about the woman who spent every evening building her dream cabin. Nash nodded. That was her. Nobody laughed anymore. For the first time, someone else's truth was louder than Sienna's story. My cousin Landon quickly pulled out his phone. Wait. If that's true. Before anyone could answer, Nash quietly unlocked his phone. I've got something. He scrolled through dozens of construction photos. The cleared land, the foundation, the framing, the roof. Then one picture stopped everyone. I was standing beside the cabin, holding a paint roller and smiling. I took this during construction, Nash said. The room fell completely silent. Mom looked at me in disbelief. You built all of this? I quietly nodded. Nobody knew what to say. Dad looked confused. How could you afford all this? I smiled. Planning. I explained that I'd saved money years before my marriage. I'd never touched it. The land had been purchased outright. Only a small portion of construction had been financed. Even that loan was comfortably within my budget. Gavin hadn't paid for it. My family hadn't helped. Everything belonged to me. Sienna looked genuinely shocked. She had spent months telling everyone I had nothing. Instead, I'd quietly built something permanent. Mom finally asked the question nobody had asked before. So, were you really sleeping in your SUV? I nodded. Sometimes. The room became quiet again, but only because I wanted to stay close to my land while construction was happening. I wasn't stranded. I was supervising. I smiled softly. My SUV wasn't my home. It was my temporary office. The difference changed everything. Sienna crossed her arms. You could have told everyone. I slowly unlocked my phone, then opened our family group chat. Message after message appeared. Nobody asking, how are you? Nobody asking, are you safe? Only assumptions, rumors, pity. Then I quietly looked at my mother. Not one person ever asked me what was actually happening. The room fell silent. Because they knew I was right. Nash cleared his throat. I probably shouldn't say this. But Calla was on that property almost every evening. Rain, heat, weekends. She carried lumber, painted walls, planted trees. Then he smiled. I've built houses for 30 years. I've never seen someone work harder for a fresh start. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Sienna looked down at her plate. She couldn't argue with someone who had watched the entire journey. I finally looked directly at my sister. You knew I was working. She didn't answer. You knew I had a job. Still nothing. You even knew I'd been driving outside town every day. Finally, she whispered. I didn't know about the cabin. No, I replied. But you knew I wasn't helpless. She slowly lowered her head, then admitted something that stunned everyone. People kept asking about your divorce. It was easier to tell them you were struggling. She'd turned my pain into conversation. That hurt more than the rumor itself. Mom quietly reached across the table. I'm sorry. I believed what I heard. I gently shook my head. No. You believed what was easiest. If you'd called me once, you would have known the truth. Dad stared at the table. I should have asked. I nodded. Yes. You should have. Nobody defended Sienna anymore, not even herself. As everyone prepared to leave, Nash smiled. Since everyone's already talking about it, why don't we drive out to Ridge Road? Nobody expected that. About 20 minutes later, my family stood quietly in front of the finished cabin. No rumors, no assumptions, just the truth standing in front of them. Mom slowly whispered, You really built all of this? I simply smiled. Nobody said another word. As everyone left that evening, I walked to the entrance of my property. I slowly closed the wooden gate. For months, people had believed I was parked there because I had nowhere else to go. The truth was, I had been protecting the future I was building, and standing there, watching the sunset over my own land, I realized something. The greatest revenge wasn't proving my sister wrong, it was creating a life so peaceful. Her opinion no longer mattered. Life became surprisingly quiet after the reunion. I spent my mornings working remotely from the little office overlooking the trees. Evenings were for watering the fruit trees I'd planted along the driveway. For the first time in years, my life wasn't built around surviving, it was built around peace. Then one rainy Tuesday, my phone rang. It was Mom. Her voice sounded different. Calla, I think your sister needs you. I already knew something had happened. A week later, I found out the truth. Sienna's husband had moved out. Apparently, the perfect marriage she'd bragged about for years had been falling apart long before my divorce. The arguments, the debt, the lies. Nobody outside their home had known. Ironically, the woman who had built an entire story around my life had been hiding the biggest story of her own. That explained a lot. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was Sienna. There was no confidence in her voice anymore. Calla, I don't really have anywhere to go. I stayed quiet. Then she asked the question I never expected to hear. Could I stay at your cabin for a little while? The irony was almost unbelievable. Months earlier, she'd convinced everyone I was homeless. Now, she was asking for a place to live. If you believe kindness should never be confused with weakness, comment, boundaries matter. I took a slow breath, then walked to my desk. Inside the top drawer, I still had the envelope Sienna had once given me. Inside were the shelter brochures, temporary housing numbers, and emergency resource lists. The same papers she'd proudly handed me during the family intervention. I looked at them for a long moment, then quietly placed them into a new envelope. Sometimes, life has a strange way of returning things to the sender. The next afternoon, Sienna came to the cabin. She stood outside the wooden gate with 2 suitcases. She looked exhausted, nothing like the confident woman who'd laughed at me months earlier. I know I don't deserve your help. I don't know where else to go. I handed her the envelope. She slowly opened it. The shelter list. The housing resources. The same papers she'd once smiled while giving me. She stared at them, then looked back at me. You kept these? I nodded. Apparently, they were important. She couldn't even meet my eyes. Before she turned to leave, I quietly said, Sienna, there's one difference between us. She stopped walking. When everyone thought I was struggling, I was building something. When you struggled, your first thought was to come to the person you tried to embarrass. She started crying. For the first time, I believed the tears were real, but some lessons arrived too late. A month later, Mom visited the cabin alone. She looked around slowly. The wraparound porch, the garden, the fruit trees, the little reading nook by the fireplace. Finally, she whispered, "I never imagined this is what you were building." I smiled. Neither did anyone else. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I should have believed my daughter instead of a rumor. I gently squeezed her hand. "You should have called." She nodded. "I know." That Thanksgiving? I didn't host 20 relatives. I invited 5 people. Nash and Aubrey, Cole, 2 coworkers who had helped me through the divorce. We laughed, cooked together, ate dinner while it was still warm. Nobody judged me. Nobody pitied me. Nobody asked invasive questions. For the first time, home wasn't a place. It was the people who brought peace instead of drama. Every evening before sunset, I walked to the entrance of my property, closed the wooden gate, then looked back at the little cabin I'd built from the ground up. Every board reminded me of a choice: leaving, saving, planning, working, believing in myself when nobody else did. People thought my SUV represented failure. It had actually been parked beside the greatest investment of my life. Looking back, I understand why my sister created those rumors. Broken people often need someone else's pain to distract from their own. But I also learned something even more important. You don't have to defend yourself against every lie. Sometimes, you simply keep building until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. They told everyone I was living in my car because they believed I had nowhere left to go. The truth was, I was parked beside 5 acres of freedom, watching the future I built with my own hands. And that little cabin became something no rumor could ever destroy. They thought I was sleeping in my car because I had lost everything. The truth was, I was sleeping beside the only life that had ever truly belonged to me.